My name's Alex Balkenkwal. I'm a product manager for terminal services. This means I work in the marketing group, working with our engineering folks to look at the product, decide what features we should be building and what time frame we should build them in. Before I was in marketing, I did spend 5 years in our consulting, so I was in the field helping customers deploy and implement terminal services. So if you have any deployment questions, I will be able to answer them. So it's nice to have some understanding of terminal services. We will be going through an introduction, very brief, on what terminal services is in terms of the scenarios where we see customers using it. We'll do a brief introduction to the features, spend a little time on TS EasyPrint and talk about the architecture of that and gateway. Move on into a demo, show you from a ground-up configuration of a system. Don't worry, you're not going to see anything installing. We'll show you how to configure a system for a remote access scenario. And then we're going to go through some deployment guidance. And this is based on information that we've collected working with our TAP customers in Redmond. These are our customers who are our early deployers. We'll also cover what does this mean for Citrix. I'm sure some of you in this room are running Citrix. And the obvious question that will come out of the session are, do I still need Citrix? And hopefully we'll address that as we go through. So, what do we have that's new in terminal services? We really focused on two aspects in this release. The first aspect was our platform capabilities. So we looked at how could we improve the security, the reliability of the system, how we can make a better platform for our partners. But we really went down and deep into the core to see how we could make terminal services better. So what we did is we refactored our terminal services core. This means we did a couple of things. We separated the connection manager and the remote session manager from each other, so that rather than having a single monolithic service, we now have two separate services. The reason we did this is the session manager is actually used when you log on to any Windows system. So previously, we kind of had all the terminal server code bundled up with all the logon code. And what we've done is we've separated that. That means that, so I'll say on Vista, you can have fast user switching enabled without having to have any of the TS core connection stack enabled. It helps reduce the attack surface, means you don't have to have RDP just kind of hanging about on the system, waiting for somebody to attack it. Also has the advantage that we can patch the services much more efficiently. So for example, the core service for terminal service can now be patched and restarted. Whilst that will take everybody off the box, if they're connected, you don't need to reboot the box. So we had a look at the system to see where we could reduce the number of reboots as well. So if we ever have and I'm not saying we will, but if we ever have an issue related to the connection manager, we won't need to reboot the box to fix it. We've also put and I asked this question yesterday. That's a good question actually. How many of you came to the application and presentation virtualization session yesterday? Okay, a few of you. So for those in the room, you will get some duplicate content if you came to the session yesterday. There's a small number of you, so I'm going to make sure that I cover some of the same ground for the rest of the people in the room. So we expanded our WMI interfaces. Almost everything you'll see me doing today inside the admin UI when we do the demo is done using WMI interfaces. This means everything that you're seeing that I'm doing can be scripted. I'm not going to show you that today. I'm not much of a scripter, and I think watching me write code would be a pretty boring affair, not to mention my typing's abysmal. But we're quite proud of this because for those of you that do want to automate the system, you will be able to do it. I also highly recommend the use of PowerShell. Makes scripting WMI much, much easier. We've improved the management. We've improved the event log entries. Every event log entry now comes with a help link. You may have seen that before in 2003. What we now do is we try and have as much information behind that help link as possible. So when you go off to the link and to go off to the TechNet site, we'll bring up articles that hopefully will give you something that's meaningful in terms of how do you solve the problem, what troubleshooting steps you might want to take. In terms of scalability, and we'll cover 64-bit a little later in the presentation, we've really focused on 64-bit in this release, and to focus on how we can get through the through the scaling barrier of 32-bit. There's a rule of thumb out of there, and it's a very bad rule of thumb, by the way, where people say, how many users can I get on a terminal server? And everybody says, well, if you've got 2 cores, 4 gig of RAM, you can get 50 users. Doesn't really account for what the user's doing, but that's the rule of thumb. And it's so ingrained in people's mind, they think terminal services can't scale. With 64-bit, you can throw almost as much resource as you can possibly afford at it. It really comes down to a question of dollar per user. And we've added a lot of extensibility to the system. So we've worked with our partners to make sure that their products will work seamlessly on top of terminal services and can use a lot of the new features. And it's not as trivial as it sounds, given that we redesign things like Session Manager, the License Manager. We redesigned the sound subsystem in Windows, a lot of the device subsystems. So it's extremely important that all of those products that you're using on top of terminal services today can still be used on top of terminal services as we move forward. In terms of the features, I'm not going to go into these. We've got TS Remote App, that's our version of Seamless Windows. TS Gateway, you're going to see how we can encapsulate RDP in HTTP. You'll see that we've got the TS Web Access site. It's an easy site for a simple site for launching applications. We're going to talk about EasyPrint, and the one that's again hidden under there, I should have fixed that. The one that's hidden under there is the Session Broker, which is an evolution of our session directory that we had in the previous release. So I promised to get through these 3 marketing slides as quickly as possible. So, you know what? Let's have a look at this one. So, there's really kind of 3 key things we see when we see terminal server customers using terminal services. For some, it's about increasing the productivity of users. How do I get users to an application they can't normally use? And in terms of the application, it's about remote access, it's about branch office, it's about security, and it's about how can I do new things? How can I get an application perhaps to a device that doesn't run Windows even? So we see a lot of customers using terminal services for that. You can also use it for things like application compatibility. So if you're moving to Vista, perhaps you don't have an application that works on Vista. You can use 2003 terminal services to deliver that old application to Vista. We see a lot in terms of, I think, the mobile user, which I think is a common scenario many of you will be using. Branch is probably a really important one. Increasingly, we're seeing branch deployments of being interested with terminal services. So today, typically in branches, what we see is you have a whole bunch of application infrastructure, IIS servers, database servers, down at a branch where you probably don't have any IT support, where, well, if you've got a really good branch, they might be in a secure room, and if you don't have a lot of room, they're out on a shop floor somewhere where they can be stolen. It's really not a good idea to have your application databases in that environment. So with terminal services, you can move the application databases back to the data center, consolidate them so you have less instances. You can support them more easily. You can make sure they're part of your disaster recovery because they're in the data center. And by using a terminal server in that data center, you can place the application close to the data so that there's good performance of the application, and then remote it over the wire so you don't have that client-server traffic going over the wire. And then the largest one that we see, and this is quite an interesting one, is security and compliance. So increasingly we're seeing in financials, in healthcare, and we expect to see it more in sort of a general scenario, people are using terminal services to isolate data. So you see a lot in the news about laptops being stolen with some critical piece of data on it, be people's home addresses, social security numbers, or credit card numbers. The problem is if you've got a physical device like a laptop and you've got the data on it, you're always at potential loss of that data. By keeping the data in a terminal server and making the application available using terminal services, what you do is you limit the exposure of the data to just the data that the user's seeing. So if the user's a malicious user, they can't steal the data. And if the PC's been infected by something that's designed to steal data, the most it's ever going to be able to steal is what the user has seen. There's no data processing on the local machine. We think that's going to be of increasing importance. So what's TS Remote App? I'm going to show you a demo of this, but I just want to talk about it first. So you're going to see the TS Remote App Manager. You're going to see us configure this in the demo. And we will show you how to add an application. This is set on a per server basis, so we define these on a per server basis. And we can create MSI files, RDP files with the connection information. We can also create a web access page, which gives an easy way to launch the application. The demo will show the TS web access mechanism today. Actually, if you do the hands-on lab or you come the instructor-led lab later in the week, and by the way, the ILL and the holes are the same, so pick one or the other. If you come to the ILL after doing the hole, you'll probably be a bit disappointed. We will go deeper in the ILL than the hole, add a bit of value around it so you can pick which session you want to come to. In that ILL and in the hole, you can play with the MSI settings. In fact, the lab gets you to produce the MSI files. We can populate the TS web access page, and that's what you'll see us do in the demo. The key with this web access page is it is one web page per server, or one web page per farm of servers. We don't have any personalization, so it just shows all the applications available on the server. There's no form of user personalization whatsoever. So it doesn't matter if people are in different groups, they see all the apps. And then the application is a seamless window that appears on the desktop and integrates locally. That's not very readable, is it? The text there, obviously in the template, hasn't come out very well. The real key for this is you are going to need the RDP 6.1 client. The RDP 6 client that ships in XP/SP3 and Vista SP1. There are earlier versions of the RDP 6 client that we've been shipping as downloads. They're designed to work with the beta releases of Windows Server 2008. So the final version of the client that supports all of the features you'll see today, XP/SP3 and Vista SP1. So what's the TS Gateway architecture? And the reason I bring this up is there is some confusion over what's TS Gateway, what's TS Web Access, and what are the two doing that's different. The key here is to allow us to put RDP hosts behind the firewall. We see a lot of customers today with 2003 with native terminal services actually exposing the terminal server through their firewalls directly to the internet. Obviously, it's generally not a good idea to do that for any server because you always leave yourself open to denial of service attacks whenever you're using a port forwarding system. Also, as you increase the number of ports, a little bit higher the chance of somebody finding those ports and using them. So we use HTTPS to transfer to go across the firewall. Also makes it easier to route RDP over NATs, over the internet, and get them to the gateway server. What you'll see here is that the gateway server is in the DMZ. We know some people are a bit nervous about putting Windows machines or domain-joined Windows machines in the DMZ. We think it's fine. It's how we implement it in our pilot that we're running internally in Microsoft for the gateway. But you can take the gateway, move it back behind the internal firewall, and then what you would use is you'd use an SSL terminator, so something like ISA server that Microsoft does, or you can use a hardware SSL terminator if you want to do that. So how does this work? Well, the user connects to the TS Web Access site. They're going to log, and you'll see this in the demo, so this is the flow that we'll do in the demo. You connect and browse to the web access site. It's important to note the applications or desktops that are launched are not hosted in IE anymore like they were with the previous ActiveX object. Some of you may be familiar with the old ActiveX object that we had for launching things inside a web page. We've completely removed that for the latest versions of Terminal Server. We now integrate the client together, so both the 32-bit client and the ActiveX client are now a single client. So long as you've got the latest version of the client on your machine, you'll always be able to use the TS web page with no trouble whatsoever. No additional download. The advantage of that is most people we found didn't have the ActiveX object when they tried to go to a web page. So what happens then is we send the connection information back to the client. At this point, TS Web Access we don't use anymore. That's it. We're only using TS Web Access to get that file that we transferred the client to the launch. There's only a single operation for the user when they click on the icon. They don't have to save the file and relaunch it or anything like that. It happens transparently. They then connect to the TS gateway. What we do is we go off and we connect to Active Directory and IAS, also now known as the Network Policy Server. And we do this for two reasons. First thing we want to check, can the user use the gateway? Are they coming from a machine that we want them to come from? And are they trying to send traffic to a machine that they're supposed to? So are they sending it to either an XP machine, a Vista machine, or a terminal server that they're supposed to be sending traffic? Optionally, we can use Network Access Protection, which is NAP, to check whether the client is up to date, has all the antivirus installed, has all the latest patches. Can't do remediation over this system, so the user would have to self-remediate if they had a problem. Once that's checked, the user then establishes, or the system then establishes, a HTTPS connection to the gateway. The gateway, so it's HTTPS through this part here, and then it's RDP 3389 through this part here. So you have to have 3389 open on the back firewall, and you have to have 443 open on the front firewall. Now, once you can send traffic to here, the gateway doesn't have any interaction to decide whether the user can actually log on to an XP desktop, a terminal server, that's still controlled by that individual host. So the gateway is just deciding, can I send RDP traffic to a particular location? And the key really there is the desktops and apps are not hosted in IE. A session broker is an evolution of the session directory. The session directory was a directory that if you were using Microsoft NLB or a third-party load balancer, would remember where your active sessions were in the system. So in this scenario here, we've got a remote user, and the remote user is going to connect to terminal services. And what we do is we actually then check against the broker and say to the broker, does this user have a session? If they already had a session, we'd redirect them to the server that had their session. In this case, the user has no session. They've not logged on before. What then happens is the session broker would tell server 1, I should go back. Just to be clear, why did the user connect to number 1? What we don't show here is the NLB layer. So the user's just randomly been sent to terminal server 1. It's not that they asked to go to terminal server 1, it's that the load balancer could have sent them to 1, or it could have sent them to 2. And it might be DNS round robin. In fact, our preferred configuration mechanism is DNS round robin, so you'd round robin these two servers. So once they've connected randomly to the server, they query the server and say, I'd like to log on. But what happens is the session broker tells server 1 that there's no session, and that actually server 2 over here has less load. Perhaps there's already some users on here. And we do this based, this load based, not on connections like we did with NLB, but actually on sessions. So we base the load on both connected and disconnected sessions. And the reason that we do that is a disconnected session is still consuming CPU, is still consuming memory. We don't do any checking to see how much memory or disk or CPU is in use. We just count sessions. So it's a simplistic load balancing mechanism, but it's far more reliable than the Microsoft load balancing that we put in before, or that we were using before. Microsoft load balancing is still in the system. You can still use it with terminal services session broker, and you can still use the third-party NLB devices with session broker just like you could in 2003. So to be clear, this is a new feature that's just in addition. What happens then is a redirect packet is sent to the client, and the client actually redirects the traffic directly to the terminal server. Now the key here is this is all transparent to the user. They might see a slight flicker, and this all happens before they see a desktop. So this is happening in the initial connection process. So what happens is they start to spin up the session, and before we get to the desktop, we do the redirect. The advantage of doing this is whilst you go to a server and you are starting to log on to the terminal server, we don't log on the whole full stack before we redirect. So you're only talking maybe 3 or 4 seconds additional time before the user gets to the right terminal server. So that's it for terminal server session broker. Again, it's a bit complex, so perhaps we'll leave the questions that I'm sure you have for the Q&A session at the end. We've always had various types of device redirection. And for those of you, I'm sure that are familiar with terminal services, you've used drive redirection before. Let me just build the slide. You've used the drive redirection before, with the theory being that essentially it allows our applications to talk over the network boundary to devices local. We've always been able to do drives and smart cards. I'm going to show you TS EasyPrint, which is one of the new device redirection features. We've also added something called plug-and-play device redirection framework. Whilst this isn't true USB redirection, it does allow device vendors to write drivers that can be redirected over terminal services. So if you've got a device that you absolutely want your vendor to work over this, so long as they've got a user mode driver, framework driver, these are the drivers we use with Vista now, then you can redirect that device so long as there's Vista on the client and Windows Server 2008 on the server. And that adds support for additional devices. Out of the box, we'll be adding support for, strangely, MP3 players. We actually get the MP3 players for free. We concentrated on doing portable devices like cameras. These are what we call the MPD class. So it's anything that communicates with the MPD class. Currently, that's cameras and MP3 players. We also support, which we don't have shown on the slide, is the .NET point of service devices. So these are retail device class for if you're doing tills and things like that. The advantage of the .NET POS is that doesn't just work with Vista clients, it also works with XP clients as well. To be clear, we don't do active sync devices, which I think are often the one that most people are interested in. We're looking at how we can enable that in a future release, but I don't have any more news, unfortunately, on that. So, TS printing. So this is how TS printing used to be with 2003. Basically, this is the normal operation. This is what would happen if it worked. And I know some of you have had the odd problem with printing. So what would happen is the user would connect to the terminal server, and when they connect, their client would negotiate with the terminal server what printer driver. So we'd interrogate all of the printer drivers on the server until a matching printer driver was found. Once the matching printer driver was found, we'd instantiate a queue on the server. This means that when the user prints from the application on the server, they can print, they can bring up the dialog box, they'll render the document on the server with the print language already encoded, and then the print job gets sent to the client and rendered directly to the printer. It's already been rendered on the server side in the printer's language, it's just sent as a raw file when it arrives at the client. That's assuming it works. So, what are the historical issues with that? Well, in the model, and this is just an up-down model version, what happens if you don't get a printer match? You don't print at all, so that's kind of inconvenient. And there's lots of cases where this occurs, where perhaps the user's using a consumer-grade printer, the print driver didn't come built into Windows or Windows Server, and they put a local print driver on the machine, and there's no match on server. Even if it uses a built-in print driver on Windows Client, there's no guarantee that there'll be a print driver on Windows Server. We don't have the same number of built-in print drivers on client and server. We focus the server drivers. So anytime you've got to install a consumer-grade driver, you're going to have problems. We also have what we call close match. So the system tries to pick a print driver that's nearly the same, like a HP LaserJet 5 or some generic PostScript. The problem with that is, whilst it may appear to work, we often find that once the document comes down to the client, one of several things can happen. Perhaps you're missing some features, so your document comes out in black and white instead of color. It's not too inconvenient, but it's not good for the user. Worse still, your document can come out as complete and utter garbage. Ones and zeros, strained print language. That really is a problem for the user. We have what I like to call bad match. Bad match is more about, rather than matching the wrong thing, you've taken that consumer-grade print driver and you've installed it on the terminal server. Problem with consumer-grade print drivers is they'll happily go and write kernel mode print drivers for consumer drivers. We obviously recommend on servers that no server print driver is a kernel mode print driver, so that's going to cause you a problem. And what happens is the user might find that they have a problem with their print driver. So when they submit the job causes that to happen. The biggest problem is, because the user's using the terminal server and they get disconnected when the blue screen happens, they then connect to the next terminal server in the farm, and the next terminal server in the farm. And I've actually seen this in real life, where the terminal servers just went bang, 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 bang. Generally not very good. So what's the solution? The solution is TS EasyPrint. So what happens with TS EasyPrint is we render on the system in XPS. So what do? So we don't actually load a driver, we just have the XPS subsystem running on the server. And what we do is we use the client-side print driver here. So you notice there that little dialog box has glass. That's because we really do throw up a client-side print driver box. The advantage of throwing up the client-side print driver box is it means it's using the driver on the local machine. That means all features are going to be available. So that's the first point. The second point is the dialog box are the same dialog boxes on the client machine. This isn't some custom dialog box we've written that tries to mimic the behavior of the printer. It really is the printer's dialog box. So here I think that's actually a Xerox dialog box. So the user will see all the same print options that they normally see. What we then do is we send the details of the print job, we send a blob from here up to the print server, up to the terminal server, and when we send that up, then we start the rendering process. And what happens is, when the user clicks print in the application, we render the document to an independent print format, so XPS. For those of you who aren't familiar, XPS is our XML paper specification. It's a device-independent document format that we've created. In fact, I think you can download the session slides in both PPT and XPS format. So once it's been rendered in XPS, we reattach that blob I was talking about, the print settings, and send it back down to the client as the XPS as an XPS job. And the reason we do that is we don't actually render the document until it arrives at the client, and then we render it with the print driver. This means we're always using the local print driver to render the document, so we can have a high degree of reliability that the document is going to print out as the user expects. The ability of not having to install the print drivers on the server also means that we increase the reliability. So, I want to show you some demos now. So what I've got here is I've got a Vista SP1 machine. This is my everyday machine I use at work. And I also have a virtual machine. This virtual machine is a domain controller, a terminal server, a certificate server, a web server, a gateway server, a license server. It's everything. So you can run everything on one server if you want. Obviously, you probably don't want to do that in real life. So there's all of the components that you see running on here can be run on separate servers if you need to. I've just kept it on a single server for convenience. So this is the server manager. This is our terminal services area in the server manager. Most of the snap-ins can be accessed through this. The advantage of this area in server manager is it gives you a quick status on everything to do with terminal services. So it aggregates all of the different event logs. So you can see here the source is from different logs into a single view. Tells us quite clearly that there's some events that with an alert on, so we can go and drill in and look at the alert. And once we've looked at all the events, we can hide them for future reference, because we obviously want to clear it so that we don't see the alert at the top. Shows us what services are running that relate to terminal services. We can stop and start them all from here. Tells us what services are installed. Again, these can all be installed on separate servers. They're all installed on this server just for convenience. And we have a bunch of configuration tasks down here. So these are common configuration tasks. And they'll take you off to help on the box, which then also has links to online help, which will help you walk through some of the common configuration tasks. Both basic tasks like licensing that you've had to have done in previous versions, and some of the new tasks with setting up gateway. Not all of the snap-ins that you normally associate with terminal services are in there. And if you want to find the others, you go to Administrative Tools. And rather than expand the list yet more tools in Administrative Tools, we've collected all the terminal services one together in a folder. We didn't realize this till we did it. It also means the terminal services tools appear right at the top of the list, which is kind of convenient. And so you've got things like the remote desktop snap-in, where you can specify multiple desktops within an MMC and save them. You've got the TS Web Access Administration, so the things that are missing from the main server manager MMC are located there. So on this system, I haven't configured anything. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to configure our gateway. So I'm going to go into TS Gateway Manager. It shows us how many gateways we can see, and I can see one. And when I highlight on it, it tells me that I haven't configured any connection authorization policies, and I haven't configured any resource authorization policies. So because I want to make sure that I'm going to use this in the demo, we're going to go ahead and configure some. Oh. I have to click on policies. So I'm going to create new authorization policies. And I could create them manually. I could go into each node in the authorization policies and collect them manually. But we have a wizard that will create both of them at the same time, which kind of makes things a little easier. So the first thing that I'm doing is creating my connection authorization policy. This is who can connect to the gateway, and are they allowed to connect to the gateway. So that's what a CAP does. It's the who can connect to the gateway. So let's put, I do very, very innovative titles to my policies. And then I have to say, how are they going to log on? And I could say I want them to log on with password, or with a smart card, or I could have both. This is an or, not it's an or, not an and. So if you select both password and smart card, a user can log on with password or a smart card. I don't have smart cards on this, so I'm going to remove that. I'm going to add a grouping of users. Obviously, you wouldn't do what I'm doing at the moment. You would create a custom group, put your users in the custom group, and add them in. I'm using domain users because I like cheating in demos. We also have a client computer group down here. You could specify a set of client computers. The way you would do this, you have to create a group in Active Directory and put machine accounts into the Active Directory. Machine accounts, if you have trouble finding them, are just the name of the client computer with $1 at the end of the account name. Why might you use this? You probably wouldn't use this in most scenarios, like remote access. Where we've seen this being most useful is in those scenarios where you want to use TS Gateway to isolate your administrative workstations from your data center. Because today you have this lovely data center with all your servers locked in the data center, and then you go and enable RDP on every single one of your servers. I suspect there's a few of you who've done that. Well, what you've effectively done at that point is you've just remoted the server console outside of your data center. That's not necessarily a super secure implementation. So by using this and a firewall between your administrative network and your data center network, you can actually filter who can get to the RDP sessions and what machines they can come from. So you can make sure not only do they have to be an administrator, but they have to come from a known set of workstations that you know are kept good. It's really good from a security perspective. I'm not going to use the group today, so we'll move on. I'm going to enable device redirection for all clients. This isn't a security mechanism, it's more of a configuration mechanism, and that's because it supplies a hint to the client. If there's a malicious client that chooses not to obey the hint, then it wouldn't enforce. So that's why we don't describe this as a security feature. Gives me a summary of the cap, and it'll go off and make it. Now it's asking me for the wrap, so again, I'm going to use an imaginative name. And it picks up the group that I already had. That's one of the advantages of doing through the wizard. It does some of the steps for you at this point. And it says, what machines am I going to allow people to connect? So we did the who can connect to gateway. Now we're doing the where can they send the RDP packets. So we could have an existing Active Directory group full of machine accounts said that perhaps just have the terminal servers in them. We could create just a text list on the gateway server itself, and we'd put in a list of names, say the FQDNs or the NetBIOS names of the system, and that would control where they could send the packets to. For the sakes of the demo, I'm going to say I'm going to allow my users to send RDP packets anywhere in the network. Again, doesn't determine if they can log on to the endpoint. That's done by the security on the endpoint. This is the RDP port for the terminal server. This isn't the RDP port for gateway. So don't go changing this to 443. You should always leave this as 3389 unless you've gone and changed the RDP port actually on your terminal server or your desktops. So 99 times out of 100, you're going to leave this as is. Again, we get the little summary. When I click Finish, it's going to go off and using the WMI engine that we have, it's creating the policies. Some of the policies are included in the NPS server I have installed locally, and some are stored in the gateway. So, if I do a refresh, there we go. So you see the numbers incremented to 1. So I have my policies automatically created, and I can go and look at the policies, look at the summary, and edit them if I want to. So that's configured my gateway server. The next thing I'm going to do is configure TS Remote App. So I already have Office installed on my terminal server here, so now I'm going to define that I want to make the application available. So I'm going to add some programs. Again, it's wizard driven. We go off and look at the start menu, which is what it's doing at the moment. Queries everything on the start menu. If the application icon isn't on the start menu, then you can use the browse button down here to go off and look for an application and path it automatically. So I'm going to add in all of the Office stuff. I think that's probably enough at this point. So I can do multiple at a time. It gives me the summary. And you'll see automatically we add it to the web access site. I'm going to show you the web access site in a moment so you can see the user experience. So that's added all of the applications. Let me get rid of this bar here so you can see what's going on. So it's added all of the applications in that I want. We've just specified that these are the applications available on this server. You must note here there's nothing that says whether a user can use them or not. There's no personalization. We assume that a user coming to the terminal server is going to want to use every application on that terminal server that's in this list. I'm also going to configure some of the settings. This is a global set of settings for the applications. I always recommend that you update this to be an FQDN. I recommend you use FQDNs everywhere. And that's because certificates play quite a large part in terminal services these days. You can say I want to show a remote desktop icon on the web access server, and I'm going to say I want to use the gateway. Now obviously here my gateway is the same. I'm going to say bypass TS gateway server for local address. I'm going to uncheck it. The reason I'm unchecking it is because I want to show you the gateway using in the demo. What this is for is we don't want people who are on the local area network using these shortcuts to go through the gateway to connect to a terminal server that's already in your network. So when this checkbox is selected, we make sure we try a direct connection first, and if that fails, then we try an indirect connection through a gateway. This means only your external users will use a gateway. Apply that so I don't lose it. I'm going to sign with a digital signature. Now I'm going to use the same SSL certificate that I'm actually using for the website. We automatically filter the certificates, so we only show the SSL certificates that can be used that have a server authentication purpose. That was fun, wasn't it? I'm going to try that once more. And to make it a little quicker, I'm just going to go into the snap. There we go. I'll try that once more. If it doesn't work, we'll move on. It's not critical. What I always love about demos is you can do the demos 3, 4, 5 times in the speaker lounge and they work flawlessly. And then you get to the room and I think there's gremlins somewhere in the room. That is absolutely the right one. There we go. Thank you. You can clap. So we signed the connection. The reason this is important, I'll highlight it in a moment, is it helps ensure that we reduce the number of prompts the user sees and that we maximize the number of times they can say, don't show me this dialog box again. You're going to see plenty of dialog boxes in a moment. We can also set basic RDP settings. If there's any set, this isn't every setting, if there's any settings missing, you can add them in this custom RDP setting. These are just the RDP files. They normally take the setting, something like that, so setting :I:1, so we say what they are. This isn't a dumb box either. We're trying to protect you from misconfiguration. If I do apply, it will tell me that the setting isn't recognized. So whilst it is a free text box, we try and put some validation behind it. So what's the user experience look like? Told you I couldn't type. So the default web page is always at /TS. It's going to ask me for authentication. When it does, I'm going to log on as a user. I'm not going to log on as the administrator. Oh, there we go. I was beginning to get worried again there. No, I can say to remember the password if I want to. I'm just not going to do that here. And there are all the applications that I added in the user interface, including that extra remote desktop icon. That's the remote desktop of the server that we're pointing at, or the farm of servers. Remote desktop page here can be used to connect to any desktop within the organization, so they can specify a random desktop. If you don't want the remote desktop tab to appear here, it is possible to disable that. We will have documentation. Unfortunately, we don't have UI to do it. You have to do it directly in the IIS settings for the application. I might show that in my rapid fire demo set later in the week. So let's actually launch something. Now, notice that we're in the internet zone here, down here, and this is important. Normally, if I'm in the internet zone, this box doesn't appear. The reason this box has appeared is because I signed. Remember I added the certificate when the snapping crashed? The reason we signed the connection is to validate that the server is really the one that we want to connect to. This adds an extra level of security. As soon as we do that, it means that for people in the internet zone, we can enable this box. The other option, if you don't want to use signing, is just add this website to the trusted sites list, and you'll get the same functionality. We can also specify what we want to use. I do connect. Here you'll see that by default, we use the same credential both for the gateway server and for the remote computer. I know they're the same box, but this would happen even if they were separate boxes. The reason we do this is originally we had 2 prompts, and we have tried to go through the system and actively reduce the number of prompts that the user sees. And again, you can save the credentials. So this is really where I cross my fingers. Because at this point, what should be happening is the client's now connecting to the gateway server and asking the gateway server, can I connect through you, please? It's going off and checking AD, and it's checking IIS to see if I can connect. Once I've passed through the gateway server successfully, this details button should light up. Once the details button lights up, I'm starting the logon process to the terminal server. So the reason I always get nervous is here is because if you were in the demo yesterday, you'll see I started with a pre-configured system that I know works. Obviously today I've configured the system from scratch. It might take a little while because the website seemed to take, there we go, the website took a little while to load. The reason it did that is because on my demo system here, I've got it set up to query a proxy server with IE. If I uncheck that option, it does actually go faster. So what you saw there was the logon happen, and here's Outlook. I can start another application if I want. We always assume that you want to go back to the same server, so we use the same server. We always prompt again. The reason we prompt again is to stop cross-site scripting attacks. Again, if it's trusted, we don't worry about that once it's signed with a certificate. So it just opens Excel inside the same terminal server session, so you don't have to log on for every single application. These applications are treated mostly like local applications. So if I do a WinTab, you'll see that there's my Excel application. So I can treat, so from a user perspective, these remote applications look and feel like they're integrated locally. The intent here is to reduce the number of times that the user calls the help desk to say their app isn't behaving like their other apps. We also do give a handy hint, though, because you want to know that it's remote as an administrator. So we add and append the word remote after the preview. And I think if I go into Alt-Tab, we do the same. So you can see there for Excel, we add the word remote, because we do want you as administrators and as the IT pros to know that it is a remote session. We also remote the system tray icon. So there you can see the Outlook icon. If I right-click on it, I get all the normal options that I'd be able to get. And again, on the icon, we have the remote. So what you saw, I'm going to add one more thing to the demo. So what you've seen there is me launch the TS Web Access site, authenticate with it, get that connection information down to my machine, connect with the gateway, authenticate with the gateway, and then authenticate with the terminal server. And normally that's where I end the demo. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to go back into the gateway tool. So just want to prove we really did use the gateway. Back up, there we go. So we have a monitoring tab. So you can see I am actually connected through the gateway. You can see how long I've been connected, where I've been connected from, and the IP addresses and the ports. If you're using an IPv6 system, then this will all reflect IPv6. All of the roles in terminal services fully support IPv6, so you have no issues on interrupt that you need to worry about. And if you're a vicious administrator, you can disconnect the people from here as well. But I'm going to leave the demo at that point and go back to the slide because we still have quite a bit of content to get through. So, have a whole bunch of other features. I may try and show some of these in the rapid-fire demos if I can. Some of the ones I'd call out are font smoothing. If you use font smoothing, you're going to get true type fonts. It does use a lot of bandwidth. You only want it in the local area network. You don't want to use that across a remote area network, not unless you've got really a lot of bandwidth. It isn't as efficient as I would have liked. We do custom resolutions up to 4096 by 2048. We also do monitor spanning. So if you've got multi-monitors orientated 1 and 2, you can have your remote desktop across both monitors. If it's a full remote desktop, unfortunately, we don't obey the monitors or understand the monitors, so your applications will open across both monitors. However, for remote app, if you're using the spanning feature, we do obey the windowing. So if you have an application on monitor 1 and maximize it, it'll only maximize to monitor 1. So the remote app experience is actually a little better with that. Hesitate to call it a multi-monitor feature. It is a spanning feature. I'll show how to enable this. I don't have a demo to show how much better it is. We will publish after RTM details on how much it improves. RDP. So we have 32-bit color, which is already better than our 24-bit color. It's the counterintuitive. That's the standard algorithm that we've got for Windows Server 2008. We also have an alternate algorithm for Windows Server 2008 that in our initial testing in beta shows for a heavy workload where you're using lots of PowerPoint, Excel, PDF documents, and Internet Explorer, that you can get anything up to a halving in the bandwidth. Comes at a cost though. The cost is 8 megabytes of memory a user. So it's probably something you only want to enable on a 64-bit machine. We'd love you to take away the RC0 DVDs that you got given, install and try that. It's set via group policy. What else shall I pull out? I think we talked about the NAP tools. You can do single sign-on. The single sign-on is really designed for domain-joined clients because of the nature of the policies. We have the gateway and the NAP integration. And I'm strangely proud of the single admin tool folder. I think that's convenient. We also have a licensing diagnostics tool. So for those of you that have had problems because your licensing servers have failed or your terminal servers haven't spotted that, this will allow you to interrogate the whole licensing architecture and look for problems. So we can help you take that away and get early notice of those sorts of issues. So I said SSL certificates were a big part of the process. There are really 3 types of certificates that you can get. Self-signed certificate, third-party certificate, so somebody like VeriSign, or create your own certificate authority. The demo you saw me using today, I have my own certificate authority. So let's go through these. So self-signed are really easy to set up. They're in our wizard. So you can set up the certificate within the terminal services applications and assign it. The problem with a self-signed certificate is you have to export it. So you'd have to go into the certificate wizard or MMC, export the certificate, and then import it into every single client machine that needed to support the certificate. That can be done with Active Directory. So if you want to use self-signed certificates because you're a bit unhappy with how certificates work and the complexities, you could use this and then deploy the certificate with AD to all your managed machines. Of course, that doesn't solve that deployment problem for unmanaged machines where you'd have to load it. The real advantage of the third-party server, in fact, I'm going to talk about the certificate server one next. The certificate server, you have the same sort of issues. Whilst you can generate the certificate, if your certificate server isn't signed by a third party, then you would still have to distribute the certificates to all of your machines. The advantage is if you've got a Microsoft Active Directory integrated certificate server, for your domain joined clients, that distribution happens automatically without you having to do anything. The CA certificate will get pushed out. However, again, doesn't solve the problem for your unsigned certificates, which will need to be manually deployed. Now, what you can do to get around that problem is use a third-party certificate. So you can either get a third-party certificate for your terminal server and your gateway server and your web server, so you get them independently. The advantage to that is obviously the root VeriSign certificates are already built in Windows, so you don't have to distribute the CA certificate. So you don't have to worry about certificate deployment to the endpoint. Similarly, if you get a third-party VeriSign certificate and sign your certificate server, you'll also have the same benefit, because then the root CA certificate's no longer your own CA, it's still the verified CA. The disadvantage of getting a certificate server signed is that the certificate to do that is very expensive. The other thing that's an issue is you have to get one certificate for every server. You need to get a certificate for the gateway server, you need to get a certificate for the web server, and if you're doing the RDP file signing that I showed you, you need to get a certificate for every single terminal server. Now, in larger implementations where you've got a certificate server of your own, that's not a problem. You can issue as many certificates as you want. If you don't have a certificate server and you're buying third-party certificates, that's some cost you've got to have to every certificate. What you can use, and we've been very careful to make sure that this works, is something called wildcard certs. And wildcard certs, instead of having the name of the server in the certificate, so for example in my demo I had tsdc1.contoso.com, you would have a star symbol.contoso.com. The advantage is you can use that in every server in your environment without having to buy multiple certificates. Keeps the cost down and keeps it easy. There is a slight elevated risk with a star-based certificate, in that you only know that that machine is part of the domain. However, I think for small implementations, it's really probably the way to go. So if you've got 3, 4 servers, if I was you, definitely get a wildcard certificate and don't bother mucking around with a whole bunch of different certificates, because it really is, it's just, excuse the language, but a pain in the ass. And the real important one about that RDP signing, it isn't a code signing certificate, it is an SSL signing certificate. Again, that means that if you're going to do the RDP file signing, you don't have to go and find something different. Code signing certificates, again, are very expensive. So we've tried throughout the system to give you a way to increase the security of terminal services without increasing dramatically the cost. Other things you can do, you can put the TS gateway and the TS web access server on the same box. If you do that, you would only need one certificate for that box, obviously. TS gateway server, we're going to have, obviously we have the standard edition and the enterprise edition of Windows. In standard edition, you can get 250 users per gateway, simultaneous users per gateway. With enterprise, it's unlimited number of users. Obviously, in reality, you'll be limited by the number of processors and the amount of memory we've got. We're hoping that, and again, these numbers aren't final because we haven't hit RTM yet, we're hoping that for a gateway server with probably about 2 cores and about 4 to 8 gig of RAM, that you'll be able to get somewhere in the region of 800 to 1,000 simultaneous users. Obviously, if you're pushing a gateway that hard, you probably don't want to make it your web server. So we're talking about how to get applications to work. So a lot of people tell us that application compatibility is a problem with terminal services. We come back to the community and say, so what apps break? And that's where the communication breaks down, and we find that there aren't that many number of applications that truly don't work with terminal services. There are some. There are ones that require unique IP addresses. If you're using those on native terminal services, they're not going to work. Citrix Presentation Server can absolutely help you cure that problem. We also tend to find that some apps have problems with profiles and the like. So the question is, how do you identify whether your applications actually work on a terminal server? Well, a really good way of validating it is first make sure your app runs as a user. So if you can run the app on a Vista machine running as user, you've got a good chance of getting it working on a Windows Server 2008 machine. If it works, it means it's a well-behaved application. You then want to do an actual test install of the app. So you want to make sure each of the apps works on the terminal server. So smoke test it, install it, check the basic features, check with one user. And then what some customers forget to do is you actually need to be both using the application at the same time. So make sure you do a simple test where there's 2 of you using the same application and checking you're not running into any conflicts. At that point, you've got a pretty high degree of reliability that the application's going to work. The other thing you might want to consider is if you are having trouble getting the application to work on the terminal server, is use the Vista version of the Application Compatibility Toolkit. It's not just designed for Vista, it's also designed for Windows Server 2008. And it has a whole bunch of shims you can apply to applications, especially custom applications, to con the application into think it's running on an older system. So you can remove sort of some of the version check problems that you might get. You can make sure that you use the registry and file virtualization if the application, when it's running it with 2 users, is trying to write to the same location. If you've not used the Application Compatibility Toolkit, it's well worth a download. You should make it part of your Vista deployment plans in terms of analyzing your applications and understanding what applications will and won't work in your environment. The shims that I were talking about are generally applied automatically for applications Microsoft knows about. For the applications you may develop in-house or that may be more obscure, we can't apply the shims because we don't know about the app. The toolkit allows you to apply those shims for yourself. That's the power of the toolkit. And report your broken applications to Microsoft. So report it to PSS if you're a PSS customer. If you're a Rapid Deployment Program customer, report it through that mechanism. At worst case, if you're not a managed customer in any way, please use our forum on TechNet and report the application there. The more applications we know about not working and the sort of problem or error message you run into, the more we can look at how to fix them for this version and future versions of Windows. In terms of look and feel for deployment planning, you can install the desktop experience pack. That gets you themes. You will need to enable the theme service. So if you don't set the theme service to automatic, you can install the packs, but there's no way you can get the Aero theme. If you want and it's not Aero Glass, by the way, it's Aero Basic, I think we call it. It's the same that you get if you turn Aero Glass off on a Vista machine. If you want for the users the theme to be Aero Basic for their applications rather than Windows Classic, then you'll need to set that with group policy. And double check the terminal server-side settings. By default, we disable audio, and we set our color depth in the UI to 16-bit. So if you want the maximum experience, you'll need to go into the TS config MMC and increase the color depth to 32-bit. You should try the 32-bit. As I've said, it's often more efficient than our 24-bit. And our 24-bit was sometimes more efficient than our 16-bit. So for some apps, you still may find that 32-bit or 24-bit doesn't give you a significant increase in bandwidth. I also want to say there's also a thing called desktop composition on the terminal services client. It's kind of an obscure feature, or it's obscurely named. What that does is if you're doing RDP Vista to Vista, and both machines are Aero Glass capable, for a full remote desktop session, you can do Aero Glass remoting. It uses quite a bit of bandwidth. I just want to be very clear, that does not work with the terminal server. Some of you may have seen it working in Beta 3. We disabled it after Beta 3 because it didn't meet the quality bar that we had. So that's the reason why we disabled it, to make sure that the servers ran in a reasonable performance and ran reliably. As I mentioned earlier, we include both the ActiveX client and the normal client in a single binary. If you do install XPSP3, we clean up any old RDP clients that you've got. Some of you may be in a scenario where you have the RDP client that shipped with Vista, with Windows XP RTM, the updated client we shipped with 2003, and the ActiveX client. That's a lot of RDP clients. When you install XPSP3 and the new Vista level client, we will clean all of those up so you just have a single client. The only feature that won't work on the features that won't work on XPSP3 that I've mentioned today are the plug and play device redirection. That's a Vista only feature, and the single sign-on feature. And we're still debating with the network level authentication whether to do that. If you are using the plug-and-play device redirection framework, remember the devices have to be supported, and so your device vendor will have to modify their int files. It's the MTP and WePOS devices that we ship out of the box, which is cameras and MP3 players. And the drivers, printers, smart cards, COM ports, we still use other mechanisms. For the clipboard, we've enhanced the clipboard. We now have full stream support. This increases vastly the number of types of files that will work over the clipboard. It also increases the performance of the clipboard. About the only thing you're not going to be able to do with the clipboard between a remote app and a local app is DDE, so dynamic data exchange. Most OLE functions will work quite happily. In terms of the device driver redirection, you can now choose which drives you do and don't want to redirect, so there's some granularity there in terms of letters for the user. Also, we use the same streams mechanism that we use for the clipboard. Again, increases the speed of drive redirection. And the key thing with TS EasyPrint that we talked about earlier is it does only work with Vista and XP client. And the reason that you need XP SP3, not just for the TS client, but for the .NET Framework 3, we use the XPS engine that's built into .NET Framework. Oh, and you can also set an option to only redirect the default printer on a server. So previously, we'd redirect every single client printer that the user had, including the OneNote printer, and some of those, the OneNote printer, the Office printer, some of those soft file-based print drivers. If you set this, only the default printer of the client will be redirected. So only one printer will appear on the terminal server for that user. Advantages of that are more reliability. You're not loading print drivers you shouldn't be loading. And also, within that, what else do we do with it? It's more print drivers load. Oh, and the other advantage is quicker logon. Sorry, escaped me. I talked a lot about reducing the security and warning prompts. And the real key there is signing RDP files. They'll still get initial prompts, but once that RDP file signing happens, the user will have that option both on managed and unmanaged machines to check the box that says, don't show me again for this connection. So we really, I don't know how many of you read the TS blog, but when we released some of the earlier versions of the client, you guys beat us up over the blog quite a lot about the number of authentication prompts. So, we put a hell of a lot of work into finding mechanisms that will help you reduce those prompts and make it easier for the user. I'm not going to spend any more time. I think I talked about that a lot earlier. Capacity planning. So you probably want to plan for slightly less users than a 2003 server. We have a lot of new things on the system, IE7, the new shell, the way the new parts of the file system work. So you're not going to see a dramatic increase in the number of users because of that. And to do a fair comparison, you do need to install IE7 on a Windows 2003 box. If you don't use IE on your workload, you may find that you still get more users per box. It really depends on the mix of your workload. The reason we pitch it this way is we have quite a lot of IE in our workload, our synthetic workload that you may have seen in our white papers before. The real key with that synthetic workload is it is synthetic. Customers ask, how many users can I get on a terminal server? And somebody gave me a good analogy actually yesterday. It's a bit like asking how many clowns can I get in a car? How big's the car and how comfy do the clowns want to be? And it really is like that with terminal services. Every single one of you has different users, different applications, used in different ways. And that all affects performance. You really need to do empirical testing. We can put all of the synthetic benchmarks out in the world, but if you take that number and use that as a way of capacity planning, you're always probably going to end up being disappointed. The real key with capacity planning is, remember, you can break through the numbers of user per box by using 64-bit. In fact, we're seeing, strangely, performance gains up in the over 2003, perversely up in the 32 core area. So I don't think that's a practical implementation, by the way. I think the cost per user would be prohibitive because of memory. But I want to show you that, from a theoretical perspective, there's no limit to how high you can scale on a single terminal server. It's just how much memory you want to put in it, how many cores you want to put in it, and how much that's going to cost you. So I really want you to take away from this session that you don't have to worry about scaling up. Talked about always use FQDNs. Make sure you enable that use same credential for TSG and terminal server, so you only get one prompt when you're using the gateway and the server. And if you are configuring the single sign-on, your client does need to be domain joined, and the GPs are there to set it if you want to play with it on your beta copy. I think I've talked enough about 64-bit. These are our 2003 figures. As you can see, we got some nice linear scaling. In terms of 32-bit versus 64-bit, we expect this still to look the same between a version of Windows Server 2008 32-bit and a Windows 2008 version 64-bit. So you can still expect the same sort of linearity. Again, this is me just driving home that point about 64-bit gives you scale options like you've never had before with terminal services. But 64-bit isn't a panacea. While 64-bit removes the limitations on page table entries, and whilst it'll allow you to run your 32-bit applications just like you're running on a 32-bit machine, not everything works. So a 32-bit application that requires drivers is going to be problematic. Anything where there's a kernel mode component, the kernel mode component needs to be 64-bit to run on a 64-bit OS. As long as your app's entirely 32-bit, it will run. Also, there's some apps out there that sneakily have 16-bit code still in them. Yeah, you wouldn't believe it. Often strange 16-bit VB files. There's no 16-bit subsystem, so again, test your app, don't assume. It's amazing how many 32 bits, as I say, have that one DLL hidden away. The one thing I do want to say is a lot of people say, well, where's the 64-bit of XYZ application? Well, the only benefit of a 64-bit application really is the amount of memory it can use. If you really have a need for 64-bit XL, because people often ask us, where's the 64-bit version of Office? Well, do you really have a version of XL the way you need 4 gig of RAM or more? If you do, it's probably not a good application to put on a terminal server, because if you're using that much memory, you're not going to get any shared concurrency. But the great thing with x64 is that because it behaves like very much like a traditional 32-bit system, it's much easier to migrate than say, an Itanium system. It's actually important to say the core terminal server role, not remote desktop for management, but the core terminal server role is not in Itanium. It's only in the x64 release. And there's a full list there of the features that don't work on 64-bit. So, some of you will have the question of, so what does this mean for me in my Citrix implementation? Well, Citrix has always been about taking the platform and extending it outwards, both in terms of manageability, security, scalability, and user experience, and that doesn't change. So some things I'd highlight as we went through. So remember, with Remote App, there's no granularity there. It's not a publishing paradigm like Citrix application publishing. So I hope when you saw what we went through, it really is a great out-of-the-box feature, but it's not something that you're going to be able to scale if you've got tens of thousands of applications and hundreds of thousands of users. It's probably going to be fairly hard to manage even if you've got thousands of users and hundreds of applications. So you must think of it that way. The web page, there's no personalization on it. It points at a single server. We can do multiple servers, but there with the load balancing, your servers have got to be completely homogeneous, i.e. they need to be the same operating system, the same processor revision, so x86 or x64. They have to have all the same apps configured in all the same ways. If you've got a heterogeneous system, and so you've got terminal servers on 2003, 2008, 32-bit, 64-bit, different apps on different servers, again, something like Citrix Presentation Server is going to allow you to manage that as a single coherent whole. This fades a little longer than I wanted. So, I think the other one there is, the comprehensive security and access. It really goes to that core centralized management that Citrix offer. So something like in Citrix 4 and 4.5, the new endpoint monitoring, to me is an extremely powerful and exciting feature. It allows you to monitor the user and see all the way from the ICA client on the desktop through the terminal server, through to the application on the back end, and say, where in the chain is an application performance issue occurring, and why is it occurring? Rather than the user ringing up and somebody saying, oh, well, it's all terminal services' fault. And it allows you to really identify where those problems occur. Have a healthy ecosystem. There's obviously more than just Citrix. We work with many of these organizations to make sure that they've can build on top of Windows Server 2008. So, hopefully you had a look at the features. Hopefully from a deployment planning perspective, we gave you lots of value add in terms of what you need to think about before you go in and deploy a Windows Server 2008 system. And the real planning is the key to success. Plenty of related content. You might want to come to rapid fire demos. It'll be some of the same demos today, possibly some more in-depth demos. I think I have 45 minutes, so I'll just keep demoing until the time runs out. Stop by our TS 2008 booth. By the way, if you went to the booth earlier in the week, we now have a data sheet there, which is kind of marketing fluff. But more importantly, what we do is we have a list of webcasts that we're running this month, which will be sort of 30-minute hour drills on EasyPrint, Gateway, where you get an hour of content on each of those topics. So if you want that list of webcasts, please just stop by the booth and collect that. I think you'll find those webcasts extremely compelling. And of the only resources I'll pull is the TS blog. You'll find, again, it's run by our engineers. It's not a marketing blog at all. So you'll find lots of in-depth technical detail, tips and tricks that the developers have come up with, information on how some of the stuff under the hood works. It's really quite a great blog. And I have to say, complete your evaluation and win a HTC Touch. So I think we still have 5 minutes for questions. And obviously, we can run over a little bit. If you could use the microphones at the edge, I'd appreciate it. But given that we're limited on time, if you want to shout out the question, I'll just repeat it. What about a Linux client? Again, so good question. For a Linux client, you're probably best off looking at one of our partners who creates Linux clients. So how can I be clearer on that? So RDP6 is a fairly major revision to the protocol. You can try and wait for the open source folks to reverse engineer it on Linux. I personally think that's going to take quite some time. There's a lot of new features. You can get an RDP Linux client, the 5.2 client, so our desktop, working with Windows Server 2008, but obviously you're going to have to turn off all the new features, all the new security features, and you'll be just operating in Windows Server 2003 mode. We will have an RDP licensing program. We don't announce generally who signs up for that, but look for vendors that have licensed implementations of RDP because they work with us with the full specification and can support the maximum number of features. And again, if you want a really good Linux client, I'd recommend looking at the Citrix ICA clients. That's one of the powers of the Citrix platform is they do clients for a vast array of devices. Yes? ISA configuration and TS gateway. We will have a step-by-step guide off the TechNet. So if you go to technet.microsoft.com/TS, that's the root of all of our TechNet content. So we've made a nice handy URL. And at some point, I don't know when, we will be putting how to configure ISA in front of the terminal server gateway and get that working. Oh, over there. Sorry, I don't know that I understand the question. So no, so each website has to point to a single server or a single farm. If you want to carve the website to point to different things, you're going to have multiple websites. And by default, we install into the same vroot. If you want to have multiple vRoots, you're going to have to configure that manually, copy the original vroot over, and cascade your vRoots for yourself. It's intended as a very simple solution, but it's all ActiveX code. It's a web part, so the web part can also be hosted in SharePoint, and then you can pump custom code in. We also have the old ActiveX scripting mechanisms, which make it really easy to script your own solution if you want to build a custom solution. Yes? That's right. So the question was, can you filter the application to give one group of users one set and another group of users another set? The simple answer to that is absolutely not. The only thing that we can do is, whilst you'd still be able to see the icons, you could use software restriction policies to block the application. It's not particularly a friendly perspective. You've had your hand up several times, though. So So this easy print is put within our bulk compressor, so it's compressed inside the RDP stream. It's not a separate print channel. I have no idea how it compares to something like thin print. All I'll say is our target was that it shouldn't take any more bandwidth than an existing print job. We expect it to take less bandwidth than most print jobs, but that's our target. Again, we'll try and release some information in our performance and capacity planning white papers when we have them after RTM. So why haven't we implemented? So that's a reasonable question. So I don't know if you looked at any of our betas before the release candidates. We actually had a mode which did allow you to do personalization. And what we decided is, remember I said you can create the connection information in MSI files? We decided that it would be a very good idea to say, well, if people deploy those MSI files using Active Directory to users, we can query that per user list and reflect it on the web page. We cut that at beta 3. And the reason, I'm being open on this, because it's a feature that lots of people saw. And quite frankly, the reasons that we cut it was, I think we based the idea on a poor foundation, which was that everybody uses Active Directory to push out MSIs, which I personally just, it's rare to see that. The second thing was, when people do push out MSIs, they tend to push them out to machines, not to users, if they're using Active Directory distribution. And the third thing, quite frankly, is it wasn't up to the quality bar that we wanted. So that's why we cut it. It wasn't as reliable as we wanted. And by the time we cut that, we didn't have any time to do anything else. That's the honest answer. I'm going to be honest with you guys. Well, you see, we've very much targeted the solution at people who've never used terminal services before. So, surprising or not, not everybody uses terminal services has already heard of it. So we focused on all of those people that don't use terminal services, which is a huge market, and said, how do we bring them a solution in the box that's good enough to do what they need to do when they're doing their first departmental installation or their small pilots, and really focus on giving them something that they're going to want to use to a solution. And those are the people that we focused on for this release. So I'm going to be quite honest about that. There's no hidden agenda at all there. Question at the back. So is it possible to get a SoftGrid application? So today with SoftGrid, today SoftGrid 4.5 doesn't work. Sorry, I'll go back one. Today we have SoftGrid 4.1 SP1 for terminal server, which is designed for remote desktop. So it's very much a per user personalization. With SoftGrid 4.5, which we announced, I think, in the keynote, and if you go to connect.microsoft.com, already has the bits up there. You can download the new client that will work on Windows Server 2008. It's only a 32-bit client, by the way, so you have to use it on a 32-bit version of Windows Server. And what we should be releasing sometime in the next 48 hours is some TS additions. They're very initial, very beta. And by the way, I should have said we released SoftGrid 4.5 beta. I'll get shot if I said we released 4.5. So we released the 4.5 beta bits. We're also releasing some extra additions that will allow you to use the new serverless mode with TS. And what happens is you put the 4.5 sequenced packaged in a share, and the terminal server monitors that share or that file directory. And when it sees it, it pulls it in, adds it to the remote app list, and will add it to the web page as well. Again, there's no personalization. It's just that when the server sees the app, it enables it for use. I'm not making a promise. I'm going to try and demo it in the demos tomorrow. I have never set it up. It's one of the things I'll be working on today to try and get that set up. And if I can get it set up, I will. So hopefully that answers the question.